hangs on and gets the spot. And Nick, what's your reaction? Now, Nick has talked about this all year on College Game Day, that who you play has to matter, has to be important, whether that's talking about Alabama or anybody else in college football. That if you want to incentivize scheduling, then you have to take that into consideration. What's your reaction, Nick, to seeing the decision the committee made with that final spot?
Well, I think one of the things that I've mentioned, throughout this football season is if we don't take strength of schedule into consideration, is there any benefit to scheduling really good teams in the future? Like, here at Alabama, we're supposed to play Notre Dame, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Florida State in the future outside the league. Well, those are great games for fans to see, and that's what I think we should be doing. In college football is creating more good inventory for great games that people are interested in. But do you enhance people wanting to do that, where what's the athletic director going to do? He may go cancel all those games now, knowing that the SEC is tough enough. But at the same time, I do think the best teams are in the playoff, which I think is most important. And no coach should have any complaint about what his circumstance is relative to getting in the playoffs or out of the playoffs, because they all controlled their own destiny and they all had opportunities and they had some flaws and bad losses that contributed to their circumstance. So this could be a learning lesson for each and every team and every individual on those teams.
Yeah, the committee coach was in a tough spot, and I think it had everything to do with what happened late in the year to Alabama. I think we all look at Alabama's resume. We applaud the effort and what they did against top 25 teams. But I think the loss to Vanderbilt and then, of course, the loss at Oklahoma ultimately had to do them in. Because if you put the resumes side by side with SMU and Alabama and what they had to go through in the gauntlet in that SEC, it gives them an advantage. But they lost that game. And the way they lost that game had to matter. And I'm guessing that the committee had to look at that. And SMU was a team that was ahead of Alabama by, 3 spots last week going into this bonus round where Alabama didn't have to play that extra data point, and they lose on a last-second field goal after really doing a great job, Greg, of fighting back to get into the game. And the committee recognizes that and honors that, and so here we go. We got the field, some great matchups, first ever 12-team playoff, first round on college campuses. It's going to be wild.
Nick?
Yeah, well, when you look at this thing as a whole, I'm hopeful that we learn from this first time around. I think there's a lot of learning opportunities for us. The whole criteria for how we pick teams relative to strength of schedule, we already talked about that. But then look at the path based on who gets a first round bye and what is your path to get to the championship game. In every other tournament venue, the top 4 teams end up getting the top 4 positions to get a bye. And because of what they earn throughout the course of the year relative to their schedule, who they beat and how they're ranked, they would have the best opportunity to get to the championship game. And as we pointed out already, that's not necessarily true. The 5th seed has the best chance to get to the championship from a path standpoint. That doesn't mean they're going to get there. But if you look at the ranked teams and the ranking of the teams they're going to play, they have the lowest ranked teams to get to where they want to go. And some of the higher seeds, like Oregon, is going to have to play Ohio State or Tennessee, which is, the 8th or 9th ranked teams in this playoff system, but some of the better teams in college football. So I think we can learn from that as well.
Yeah, Coach, I completely agree. We really need to reassess seeding, how we do it, what guarantees we're making. If you win a conference, are you guaranteed a bye? I agree. Just seed them 1 through 12, Absolutely. And let's see how things stack up. But this was a very difficult conclusion to come to because there was really no winning, like you've all alluded to for, the better part of the last half hour. You had consequences on both sides. You put Alabama in the field. You are now de-incentivizing participation in a conference championship game because SMU, had they decided not to play the ACC title, they say, we're not going to go. They're at 8. What are you going to do, drop them out? So you are de-incentivizing the conference championship game. Or you're going to de-incentivize the strength of schedule and teams being willing to go out of conference and play more difficult opponents. So there was no winning here. It was a catch-22 for the committee. They went with what they thought was the most justifiable outcome. It's hard to push back on it, but I do think moving forward, with where we're at with bloated conferences, with 18 teams, 17 teams, 16 team conferences, where not all conference schedules are created equal, we need to put a heavier weight on strength of schedule, because Indiana's schedule is not comparable to that of Ohio State's schedule, and they're playing in the same league.
I said Indiana shouldn't play their quarterback. He's coming closer to where I was on that stance. What it's incentivizing.
You're going to die on that hill. You're going to go.
The toughest part of this, and part of what Coach Saban is saying, and part of what you understand, and you understand probably better than the rest of us, it is hard to quantify what it means to go through the gauntlet of the SEC. And when you have to play back-to-back teams, South Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, LSU, all ranked teams, that's what Alabama had to do. That is a tough situation and tough to understand for people on the outside looking into that. And so it becomes difficult to put a value on that when we're looking at these teams. It is difficult to put a value on what it's like to play Georgia and then play Vandy after that, if Vandy comes to play, because you just now played Georgia. And for people who are sitting at home, people who are sitting in the committee room, people who are just watching this, it's hard to put something on that and say that in itself deserves some value. And that's always been the case, not just now. That has always been the case. When I played in the Big Ten, if I looked at the SEC, I'm thinking, hey, we're better than them. We're not. We just can't put a value on what that means to go through those kind of ranked games and then compare it to an SMU team or an Indiana team who didn't have to play Oregon or Penn State in a season. They just had to play Ohio State. That's tough to put a value on.
It's tough to put a value on, but to your point, it's always been that way. These conferences have never been balanced. And they're just now more unbalanced now that you have 16, 18 teams in them. But here's the thing, guys. After the last few years, I think they got it right. Based on the criteria that we have to deal with this year.
Are you saying they didn't get it right before?
We're not going back. I'm just telling you right now, based on the criteria that we have to deal with this year, I think they got it right. I think when you look at some of the things that the coaches have said, especially Lane, about rewarding or penalizing a team for playing in a conference championship game, you don't want to do that. And I'm glad they didn't do that to SMU. And so
you keep saying playing.
They played.
They lost.
But see, here's the thing. Here's the thing I think is really important that you guys have talked about with the bloated conference schedules. SMU's path to get there wasn't the same as some of the other ones. You mentioned Indiana versus Ohio State in terms of difficulty of conference schedule. They got the easier teams. Now, sometimes you can't control that. You don't know Indiana's going to be great, but you have to evaluate it for what it is. And if a team does find itself taking an easier path or having been handed an easier path, that has to be given the proper consideration, because we keep saying value. I think the committee values this. Where the difference in judgment, Nick, comes into how much value. Did you give the weight? In most cases, all of us look at, did you give the weight that I would have given it as you look at this?
Yeah, but my point earlier was that if SMU was 8 and they played in the conference championship game and they lost by 3 points, they shouldn't be penalized for that necessarily. But my question about all the strength of schedule, 15th strength of schedule versus 60th strength of schedule, that should have been taken into consideration before they ever played in the championship game. All right, so maybe they're ranked 12th, and if they win the game, they get in. If they lose the game, Clemson gets in. All right, so, but it wasn't that way, so now it looks like they have to get penalized. But if it was done based on strength of schedule to start with, that wouldn't have been the case. So I really, think that playing in this conference, and I played in this conference for over 20 years, and when you have to go play Tennessee, then you got to go play LSU, all right, then that team that you play next, you may be more vulnerable to. And you have to have a very mature, competitive team that has a lot of depth to be able to play through all these circumstances, and it's very, very difficult. And to not take into consideration when you don't beat one top 25 team, not one top 25 team, and you went through your whole season and never had to, Indiana didn't do that, SMU really didn't do that, so it makes a huge difference. I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers got beat by the Cleveland Browns. That's my point. That's the only one I got. You guys go with it.
I think Coach Saban makes a great point, which is why you have to watch the games and look at the games. You're right, Coach. These schedules are imbalanced, and you don't play a top 25 team. But if you don't do that, then you should beat the brakes off the teams you play. And you should watch these games and look how you perform against these teams that are inferior. And I think the committee did a really good job of looking at that because, again, we can look at all these schedules. Look at Texas's schedule, okay? They're valuing those 2 losses because their best 2 wins are A&M and Vanderbilt. And so if we want to talk about the schedules being imbalanced in the top 25 teams and look at the best wins and look at the best losses, it's always going to be imbalanced. That's why the committee has to sit there with the coaches on that committee and watch these games and pay attention to how these teams play. Understood.
But don't make it sound like they don't. And I hate when we do that. I hate when we make it sound like the committee is not sitting there watching the games the same as we are, and they have opinions the same as we do. But when we get on this show, it just makes it sound like you guys should watch the games. That's what they do. They watch the games.
Nick?
The one thing I'd like to say is, I think we have flawed circumstances that we can learn from. And I have all the respect in the world for the committee and the process that they went through to come to the conclusion that they came to. So I don't want anybody to think I'm being critical of the committee. I think they had a very difficult job, and they did a good job based on the circumstances that we have. But I do think we should make some adjustments to this in the future, and one of those things should be play more good games. In other words, instead of playing 8 SEC games, maybe we should play 10. Maybe we should play 10 ACC conference games. So then you have 4 really good teams in the ACC, and Clemson didn't play them, and SMU didn't play them. All right, so how do you evaluate that? So maybe if we played more games, that you'd have a better opportunity to play more good teams in your conference, which would make it clear for the committee. And how you get in for winning a conference championship, we've already talked about that. But I don't want anybody to think that I'm disrespecting the committee in any way, because I think they had a very difficult circumstance based on the system that we have.
Kirk?
I remember last year when we had the 4, that there was a big debate. And I think when we went to 12, there's some people that thought, we're not going to have this big debate next year because we're going to have 12. And of course, you're going to have a debate. Rece, you guys do it, even with a field of 68 in March. So there's always going to be a debate. I think in this case, there just wasn't going to be a right answer no matter what. I think they got the teams that probably what we all expected to be in after the results from last night. Now it's, hopefully, Rece, you made a good point. Maybe love to see some unification of the group making decisions to tweak this starting next year, whether it's the rankings. Coach, I was going to ask you, has there ever been a talk about one group scheduling all the games instead of it being done in a silo, the SEC, the Big Ten? Because there were so many weeks this year where we had 6 really good games, and then the next week there weren't any marquee top 25 matchups. It'd be great if we somehow, like the NFL does with one office, they get together and they look at the scheduling from a kind of a broader view, as opposed to just by looking at it like we're still in 1985. I'm just wondering, now that this game has become so national, is there any way that we could get the schedule makers to all get on board to try to kind of deviate the scheduling, as opposed to just everybody doing it, kind of hiding, get away, we're going to make our own schedule? That would be very helpful, I think, in the future.
Well, I think, one of the things we can learn from where college football is, whether it's name, image, and likeness, paying players, transferring, all these things are going to have an impact in the future, because even when this court case gets settled, some people are going to be able to revenue share at a different level than others. So does that put teams in a different category, and then do those teams play each other? So I do get your point about scheduling, but I do think that the whole landscape of college football has changed dramatically. And, it's great for the top teams, but it's going to minimize the impact for some of the other teams. Maybe 100 other teams in college football are not going to have the same opportunity that the top 30 have. And those top 30 may end up someplace in and of themselves playing each other. I think if we have that, it would be certainly easier to find out who the best teams were, because you wouldn't have so many games that were so imbalanced in terms of who should win and who should lose.
All right, That's it. We've made a date. The 6 of us, Kirk's Place, sometime in the summer. We're going to set the whole schedule. We'll have a big TV show for a schedule reveal, and off we go from there. Feel good about that? That's how we'll do it.
Love it. I'm in.